This next panel is going to be looking at transforming healthcare, integration and accessibility. We are witnessing what some are calling an evolving healthcare nexus, where the rapid advances of technology, care digitization, value-based care, and data liquidity are enhancing population health outcomes and changing and shifting the healthcare landscape faster than at any time before. Sustainability of resources, finance and funding, human capital development, innovation, research and development. Each strand of this industry is crucial in coming together to ensure the health of tomorrow's generations. So, how do we knit these strands together into a cohesive whole and develop an integrated healthcare system that ensures care for all? Joining me to discuss these topics and probably more is Dr. Kurt Newman, President and CEO of the Children's National Hospital, Madeline Bell, President and CEO of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Keren Leshem, CEO of OCON Healthcare, and Dr. Thomas Cahill, founder and managing partner of Newpath Partners. I think they all deserve a round of applause for sticking around and putting up with all of that went before. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gents, let's start now. I'd like to start, if I can, with one question for everyone, and I'll come down the line to get a broad perspective on this idea of healthcare integration. As I mentioned there, healthcare has traditionally been seen in these blocks that I mentioned: public and private sector players, R&D, innovation, healthcare providers and regulators, all operating in silos. So Dr. Newman, I'll start with you. How do we break down this siloed system? Should we break it down? And what are the new paradigms that the healthcare sector should consider in forming a more integrated whole?
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be here in Dubai at this just amazing summit, and thank you for the organization for including us on this panel. I think we heard just such an impressive discussion around the impact of the pandemic, and I think, I deal with children, and seeing the impact of the pandemic on children really relates to the question that you asked, because we see that many of it wasn't just a healthcare crisis. It's the schools, it's food, it's just so many intersecting issues that if we just try and treat things medically, we're going to fail. And I think that was brought out very clearly. So for example, if we just, and when you think about children, if we just thought about, say, diabetes as a disease that was treated, but didn't think about food and access to food, we'd really not make much impact. It can't be just cured by insulin alone. We have to change behaviors. And so to do that, we need, whether it's the payers, the scientists, the public policy, all coming together. And, a novel approach that we had at our hospital was to look at food as medicine and work with pharmacies and a food pharmacy to help treat the diabetes and provide access and teach families how to care for diabetes. That was not something I learned in medical school. But that's the kind of thinking that we need for these types of diseases and issues, particularly in children.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. Madeline, to come to you next and continue that thread of innovative ways of thinking of things that you wouldn't usually as healthcare. Has that factored into your experience in breaking down these silos and creating a more integrated system?
Yeah, I think I'll talk a little bit about discovery and how to get discovery to the bedside and much quicker than we do today. We are in the midst of trying to get medical devices and gene therapies to the bedside in a quicker fashion. And the cycle time to get it from the lab to the bedside means that each one of the stakeholders in the cycle has a long cycle time. And so if I were to think of the way to innovate on that, I would get governments, regulators, venture capitalists, private equity, drug company, medical device companies, and third-party payers at the sharp end of discovery sooner in the process. We were the first to discover the first FDA-approved gene therapy in the United States. It took us 20 years to do that. Can you imagine if we reduced that cycle time by even 10 years? The same, we were the first to deliver cancer immunotherapy successfully in CAR T cells in a child. That took us 10 years as well. And I'm trying to reduce that cycle time, but we can't reduce it until we can get all these stakeholders at the sharp end of discovery so that we can make that happen. I think His Excellency mentioned the ability to get the vaccine to the bedside much quicker, so we know that it can be done. And I would finally say that the technology that was used there is a technology that we should all be paying attention to, messenger RNA technology, and invest in the future.
Thank you. And the same question to you, Dr. Cahill, from your perspective, a new approach to an integrated healthcare system.
Sure. And thank you all for having me. I think, as you saw with the pandemic, or in general, kind of a renaissance of medicine. I'll just use a story. You're probably familiar with it at Penn. In 2011, melanoma was a disease that about 5% of people lived 5 years after diagnosis. And by 2017, it was tenfold that were still alive, and that was due to Keytruda. And how did that kind of drug get developed? It's really about longitudinal data. So you have to understand the human biology. So what we really need to focus on is hospital systems and patients continuing to get care and studying them from the diagnosis all the way through to their treatment protocol. What often happens in most of these systems is they're lost to care, and that's a huge, huge loss to society. A single patient is often the reason that we solve most diseases. A single patient from San Francisco who was actually sequenced in New York 10 years after being unable, he was likely to have HIV, was never infected numerous times, ended up being the reason that right now we have a therapy called Rivarock. And so single patients, when we follow them, actually are much more important than we really realize. And so I think the longitudinal study aspect is super important. For instance, we talk about long COVID. We don't actually study patients through long COVID. We just kind of say they have it, and then we lose them to follow-up. So it's really important that we keep patients in the system and follow them throughout their lives. And two examples that do that, UK Biobank and Finland, are examples where they've really done a good job since 1972 in Finland and more recently in UK.
And Keren, the same question to you.
Well, I come from the private sector, and I think that we need to develop a more holistic approach to healthcare in general. So it's not just the private sector's job, or just the government's jobs, or just the university job, or just the healthcare system's job. I think that we need to educate from a very young age, even in the schools, to create a more innovative way of thinking, and that runs through the entire ecosystem. To be able to deliver innovation and new therapeutics, to study current therapeutics, to look at therapeutics that we have today on the gender issue. And so it really needs to be a more holistic view in that sense.
I think what's fascinating, just from an opening gamble, is that we talked about integration. We've got 4 very different perspectives across the healthcare continuum. So bringing all of these perspectives is a first step, I guess, and then we have these discussions about how we can bring them together. And you mentioned there, Keren, education. So I'll go back to you now, Dr. Newman, on education and the importance of engaging young people and pediatrics and care for children. Digital health is not a new concept. When it comes to pediatrics and caring for children, how much more can we innovate and how much more can we deliver when it comes to healthcare and patient outcomes specifically from the perspective of children's health?
Well, I think the digital revolution is going to revolutionize healthcare, and I think it'll just about any dimension you look at is going to be completely changed. Whether it's ICU care that is where you can deliver that from a central command center to ICUs across the country or throughout the world, or whether it's personalized medicine where you can gather data all the time on patients and particularly in our case in children, so that you can follow the treatments and the impact of those treatments. But I also think it's going to play a big role in democratizing the care. For example, we have a scientist who's been working on facial recognition of genetic diseases in infants, newborn infants, and to almost a 99% specificity can make diagnoses with a camera and an image that then using machine learning and AI can make the diagnosis of many genetic conditions without needing a geneticist or the laboratory work. So that type of example, I think, is going to spread a lot of the science that we have, and just like Madeline was talking about, find ways to get that outside the laboratories, outside the hospitals, really into where countries that may not have access to the current science and technology.
I'll stay with you on this thread because you mentioned democratizing healthcare. How do you begin to go about that to ensure equitable distribution of healthcare to all in this idea of democratizing healthcare, which we've heard many people mention already today at the forum and the Global Health Forum itself?
Well, I think that's I think the digital revolution and access to it because of smartphones and the capabilities there is going to lower the threshold of, and smart people are going to figure out ways, just like this example of facial recognition, are going to find ways and then link that to AI so that what feels like a big hurdle in technology now will be simplified, less expensive, and more available. For example, MRI technology right now is very localized to big investments. But if you could, and this work is happening, and we have scientists working on this right now, a much less intense version that can be deployed in areas that never have that kind of access, you can just make huge advances.
Madeline, I want to stick with this thread and pass it on to you to bring your perspective to this idea of democratizing healthcare. And how do we scale innovation in healthcare? How do we put the strategies in place to ensure healthcare for all? And is there a trade-off to be had when it comes to investments in innovations and novel technologies? What do we need to put in place in terms of strategies? And is there a trade-off when it comes to actually implementing these ideas?
Yeah, I think the trade-off comes with the cost to the system. As an example, I mentioned the gene therapy that we discovered. We were making this vector in our lab, and it was costing us very little. And as soon as it was approved by the government, it was $1 million a dose. The same with the CAR T cells. As soon as it was approved, we went from making it in our lab, dollars, to delivering it at $450,000 a dose. And I think we're seeing certainly a disparity in those who have access to those high-cost drugs, and particularly for children, because we as children's hospitals are aggregators of rare and orphan diseases, almost all of them genetically linked to diseases. And so we've got to figure out a way to be able to deliver that to broader populations and not those who have just insurance or who can afford it in our country.
I'm going to stick with you again, because, this is the big question in healthcare, right, is access. And there is always debate around why don't some populations in some areas have the same access to medicines. If you had to try and solve it in 2 minutes on this stage right now, how would you begin to create more equitable access to medicines?
Yeah, I think the only way you can do that is to have governments step in and partner with the providers to ensure that happens. I know we, as providers in the United States, are often providing the care that Kurt talked about in underserved communities and ensuring access to those communities. But we have to partner with government in order to say that these are the populations that we're going to ensure have access. How do we do that together so that it's not just left to the hospitals to figure out how to ensure access to everyone? And digital access is difficult because, at least in the United States, not everyone has access to digital technologies. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to partner with private companies to give digital access to underserved communities.
The access to digital kind of goes hand in hand with the delivery of healthcare. Then I think at the moment there's still around 2 billion people who lack access to the internet. So one of those challenges goes hand in hand with the healthcare thing, if you're looking at integrating the two. Dr. Cahill, to come to you, something that Madeline mentioned was that healthcare is still seen as a cost to the system, and their excellencies, when they spoke earlier, also mentioned it, and Dr. Mike Ryan mentioned healthcare as still being perceived as a cost to the system. From your venture capital background and thinking about funding models, what are the barriers to driving greater investments and overcoming this misperception that healthcare is still a cost to the system?
Well, I think healthcare is going to always be a cost to the system. I think the difference is, so just to step back, obviously it's a small world because we work with the same people. In terms of how drugs are developed and discovered, there's about 30 scientists, but maybe 28 in the entire world who have basically developed or been part of 72% of all FDA-approved drugs since 1988. And about 10 investment firms basically fund those companies. CHOP was an exception of that 70%, where they actually bet on their own academic, and they made $700 million off that investment. And so it's a very small community. But the question of how to lower healthcare costs is, I would phrase it more as the human capital benefit, and this is how I've talked to CEOs who run large companies. If you're able to solve, and we can talk about this, solve obesity, solve high blood pressure, solve high cholesterol, you're going to get more work out of the people. And so if you're able to increase life expectancy 5 years, which you could do with these new GLP-1 drugs, you're going to get a lot more work out of your workforce. But still, at the end of life, no matter what, I think the cost is always going to increase because of innovation. It's always the most expensive year of life. It's just that 5 years in between is going to be a lot more value to the country, to the company, to society, to the family. And so I think you have to view it from that perspective. And in these drugs, I'll just talk about them. And by the way, anything I'm talking about up here, these folks are all doing amazing things. I'm not going to talk about anything I have ownership in or I don't want any conflicts, but it is true. I just want to mention this because it's really important. These new drugs, and you've probably heard of them, basically every wealthy person in the US and every politician probably is on them, but these new GLP-1 drugs, Ozempic or Wegovy or Mounjaro or tirzepatide, they are completely transformative in the world. I mean, we're going to look back in 10 years and we're going to ask, what were we doing? And I was just with Congress a couple weeks ago asking why they're not funding this in the US with Medicare. And 3 states are funding with Medicaid: Florida, Texas, and Georgia. But these drugs prove, we worked with Novo designing what we call this billionaire trial. And again, I have no ownership in these companies, but I just want to make sure you understand how significant this is. They basically showed that obesity is a disease of aging. And what they show with this data is if you exercise and you eat a perfect diet, you'll lose about 5.5 pounds or 2% of your body weight over 68 weeks. But with that drug, people lost 33.7 pounds, or about 16%. It was a 5 sigma standard deviation. They went to the FDA in February of 2020. It was approved 4 months later. And the biggest issue was during that time, why were people susceptible to COVID was age and weight, and we never talked about it. The drug was never made available. And so I just want to make sure people realize that, because that will completely change outcomes in the US. People will live longer, but it's still going to increase costs. It's an example of where it's going to be transformative. It already is. I mean, if you see anyone who said all of a sudden lost a lot of weight and they say they were exercising, they were on the drug as well, for sure.
There's so much I want to dive into there. You said, if we look back in 5 years and we say, what were we doing? So what are we doing? What is being done to speed this process up?
Well, I think just passing it along. I mean, what you're seeing in the U.S. is you can go two ways in the U.S., and each system is different. In the U.S., you can either go through the government, or a quicker strategy, just like with COVID, is you go through the most influential people. And when the most influential people are doing things, it tends to trickle down. It's kind of trickle-down medicine, as I call it. If people are on something, it tends to spread around. I think just discussing it, because it sounds kind of too good to be true, and that's why I bring it up here. But the cool part about it, they've been around 20 years. Ozempic's been around 20 years, and it's been a treatment for patients with diabetes who are high risk, and the side effects are very limited, and the benefits are very high. And the drug, they are literally, I mean, I was just on the phone with someone, they are building manufacturing facilities in China just making this drug, because it's now like they can't get enough of it. And so but I just want to the cost will still go up. So if you were to cover this with Medicare, we map this out, it would save about $1 trillion to the healthcare system over a 10-year period. But the cost would probably still be higher from other diseases that you don't take into account. But that's still a lot of money in the U.S. system. And here, obesity is 50% of the U.S. population, and here it's growing as well, and all over the place.
Thank you. I do just want to say, guys, if you're going to have conversations, please keep them respectfully low, because there is a speaker who is imparting a lot of knowledge and wisdom up here, and it would be great if the people at the back could hear him as audibly as we can at the front. So thank you. One of the things you mentioned there, Doctor, was human capital development and the importance that role plays. So, Keren, I'll come to you. And you mentioned education and the importance of that and your perspective from the private sector. So how do we train the future workforce going into healthcare in the future to have the skills, capabilities to deliver the kind of innovation we're talking about in healthcare?
So I think healthcare needs to evolve and is evolving all the time. And, when I look at my colleagues here on stage and on the funding part of it, I think that when we look at funding, we are developing also drugs and therapeutics that are more personalized to a specific subset of humans. I think that when we educate and we bring together the ability of digital health, we also have to know what to do with that AI and big data. Those are big words. But if we know how to read into that and take that information over a period of time and make good with it, if we look specifically at children, specifically at women, specifically at people of color, so we can have a lot of data that will drive a lot of this innovation. The other thing we need to make sure is that we know how to build a society that thinks innovation. And this is where the government comes in. If we have schools and ways to bring children into hospitals and universities earlier on, and bring the university students into our private sector to see how innovation is built and how innovation changes the way we think, the way we act, the way we eat, and the way we even diagnose ourselves. I think digital health has a huge impact. And today we're such a small world. The minister here was talking before about the fact that the UAE is so diverse. There are 200 different nationalities here. Imagine all the work that can be done to test it. But I see, because I have wonderful venture capital firms investing into our company, the more they invest, the more we need to bring back return on investment. And so these drugs are very expensive. But if the government puts in money towards the companies together for the clinical studies, which are very expensive, this will benefit the hospitals that are doing these clinical studies. This will allow access into the communities where we can find the women and children and men that require these therapeutics. And if the government puts together these funding propositions, I think that at the end, healthcare costs will maybe come down, because when government puts money, there's no return on investment that the companies need to provide, but the return on the government investment is, of course, better healthcare and better access to it.
Public-private partnerships, another constant theme across the World Government Summit throughout the years. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, so we'll go the reverse way. We've started with you every time, Dr. Newman, so I'm going to share the love around and start at this end of the panel this time. We've discussed kind of innovation as a concept and in some instances as some concrete examples of time to the bedside. But I want to know, and I would think the audience would be interested in all of your thoughts on, do we have enough of the right kind of innovation? And if not, how do we channel that so that the patient journey in the future is a successful one? What does that patient journey look like? And how do we propel the right kind of innovation in the healthcare sector? Start with you, Keren.
Well, again, I think digital health will play a huge role in this. I think the patient journey starts from when the patient is healthy, to collect data from specific groups and organizations and societies. And so this journey, when the patient already comes to and visits the healthcare professionals, there's a lot of data and background that we know of him or her that we could use with big data, with AI, to say, this person is now suffering from obesity, but he also has issues with his heart, unlike the other person that is suffering from obesity and now has issues with his eyesight. It really changes throughout the patient journey and also the age and the diversity of the population. So I think digital health will be a huge impact here, but it has to start from looking at people when they're healthy, not necessarily when they're just sick. As we said, the heroes of health come and they actually stop the flood when we have a pandemic. But we need to do a lot of work even beforehand and to treat diseases at the source, to make sure that there's personalized medicine, to know that we look at people before they even become sick and address those concerns well before there's a pandemic or an outburst of a health issue.
Dr. Cahill, coming down the line to you.
Sure. This goes back to my point at the beginning about longitudinal studies. It is the biggest group we have to actually educate are doctors themselves. And the reason I say that is the most transformative thing we could do is actually, and let's take out all the privacy issues and other concerns, just say what we could do in science and medicine to actually transform healthcare. Because the only diseases we ever solve are ones we understand the human biology of. Cystic fibrosis is a good example. So if you were to sequence everyone who's born and you follow them longitudinally, you will actually discover and solve, I would say, a majority of human disease, even polygenic diseases, at least to understand them. We do not understand why diseases happen, and the populations with which we have data on are mostly Scandinavian and Northern European. And if you were to just sequence folks, and let's say the cost is $2,000, it's getting cheaper, but let's say it's $2,000, and then you follow them like Finland did. You take blood samples, you follow them every year, you actually can figure out why something happens. What happens in the US is they get lost to follow-up. They'll go to one hospital, then to the next hospital, and you actually lose them. The real key is if you can do this and actually get doctors buy-in. Right now, doctors, even I'm in Boston at some of these really great hospitals, they don't really believe in sequencing yet, even though we're all just a double helix. We're all just DNA. And if you understand that, it actually changes the outcome for your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids, because you're passing on 50% of that. And so I think that's the most transformative thing. And the second thing, just quickly, is whenever something doesn't seem to make sense, is typically because there's something underlying that people aren't paying attention to. So why is the FDA really slow in the US right now? So during COVID, it's kind of interesting. During COVID, and you may be dealing with this, 65% of clinical trial coordinators left. So basically, the U.S., people have to go in when they're sick, they have cancer, or they have a fatal disease. They have to sign up and register. During COVID, the nursing staff just left. And so the barrier in the U.S. is actually, we just don't have people enrolling patients. It's not that the system is slow, it's that we're not paying attention to the actual culprit of the problem. The other issue is we can't get to clinical trials because we don't have non-human primates or monkeys. They're the closest relatives of us. And given the issues between, we'll use the U.S. and China, most of the monkeys used to come from China. Now they only come from one place in the U.S., San Antonio. If you go to San Antonio, that's where all the monkeys are. So often when you're saying it's frustrating or there's an issue, you have to figure out what the issue is and pinpoint on it, and then you can kind of solve it. But if complaining about it doesn't make sense. But the sequencing thing is what we have to do. I mean, and I think UAE and they're doing sequencing here. I think they've sequenced 30,000 folks already, and I know actually in Riyadh they've done 200,000 patients. If they follow those patients, it's going to be completely transformative to the healthcare outcomes, because you're going to understand diseases. And this region has a lot of inherited GI disorders we don't understand. And it's kind of a multicultural melting pot that has been that way for 4,000 years. And so the amount of information we're going to get is extremely valuable.
Thank you, Doctor. Madeline, do we have the right innovation? I love these answers, tangential as they might be. I'm trying to stay focused on bringing it back to innovation. Do we have the right sort? What does a successful patient outcome look like?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the successful patient outcome is decrease in mortality and morbidity and not increasing the cost to the system. But I would like to double click on what Dr. Cahill said. So what we're doing on a small scale at our hospital, I think having entire countries do would be helpful. So we are sequencing every baby in our neonatal intensive care unit. We call it Baby Eagle, and marrying that information with all the omic data we could have. So proteomic, transcriptomics, metabolomics, not just genomic information. So we have the health record, all of the omics together, which creates a picture. If we can't diagnose them, then we can't treat them. So starting at the very beginning. And I also would like to say Iceland is another place. We have a researcher from Iceland at our hospital, and they have sequenced their entire population. 200,000, or I think Iceland has 300,000 people.
Recode, right?
Very small population, but if you can do that and scale it using government to do that, I think that would be a real differentiator and a real innovator.
Was it Baby Eagle, did you say?
Yeah, we call it
because
Baby
it's
Eagle.
In Philadelphia.
Yes.
Because it's in Philadelphia?
Because it's in Philadelphia, and the Eagles just lost the Super Bowl.
I wasn't going to mention it. I didn't mention it at all. Although I know Dr. Newman mentioned it the other day in passing. Dr. Newman, let's come to you. Do we have the right sort of innovation, and what does a successful patient journey look like for you?
Well, again, coming from the pediatric perspective, and I appreciate the science that we've been talking about. I think there's so much more that can be done, and to turn the investment cost discussion upside down. And I just love the discussion of the health ministers. Think about the investments if we made in mothers that are carrying babies, for example, where we've done research on using MRI technology on the developing brain that shows that, for example, maternal depression really impacts and decreases the development of that brain. Think about the lifetime of that baby and that child, where we could have intervened around the maternal depression. You don't even need all the genetics and all of the omics and all of that. You can make, there's so many ways that we can make impact and have a tremendous impact on these babies and these children's lives. That's the kind of thinking that we need to transform health. Because I worry that if we just rely on scientific innovation, we saw the difficulties of getting vaccines into children. So there's so much more that we can do that go beyond science to make that science effective. But again, those investments in children, I think, then have that long-lasting impact. Think about if you discover an impacted autism, what kind of impact that would have. We would not even worry about the cost of doing that. So, I'm the other side of this, and seeing it through the lens of the pandemic, is the incredible optimism and courage of people going into medicine and into science. And I think that is what I'm really feeling in this conference, this room, is just that sense of commitment to really solving these problems.
Fantastic. I think we've got 10 seconds left, so we'll pause it there. Dr. Newman, Madeline, Dr. Cahill, Keren, thank you ever so much for your time. I hope you found that as insightful and useful as we all did up here. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.